In this first episode of G-Spodcast I'm meeting Professor Bojan Aleksov. Professor Aleksov is one of the best specialists on Balkan history, and he's Associate Professor at University College London. He's a co-editor of the book Wars and Betweenness, Big Powers in Middle Europe 1918 to 1945, and author of the book Jewish Refugees in the Balkans 1933 to 1945. With him we discussed the past and the future of the Balkans, the role that nationalism and religion played in the history of the region, the fate of the Jewish population during World War II in Bulgaria and in the region of Macedonia. And we even talked about the protests in Serbia and why Aleksander Vucic is still in power. But listen and see for yourself in 3, 2, 1, now. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Professor, that you agreed to come here. You're the first guest of G-Spodcast, actually. This is gonna be written in history. You're the first guest, and I wanted to start with something that is very familiar to me and something local. I'm a Bulgarian. You're from Serbia, and what better than to speak about the history of the Balkans? So I want to talk about nationalism. How is it intertwined with religion, the wars, how the great powers basically use as puppets or use any kinds of means to control the peninsula for their interests. So this is very important, to figure it out and to understand how that happened. But let me start with this. I think it's very important because I think the Balkan history and Balkan people in general have maybe not Balkan history, but Balkan nations have a not so good of a PR in the West. So why are the Balkans famous as the powder keg of Europe? Where is this coming from? Is it from the assassination in 1914 or the previous from Bismarck? Where is it coming from exactly?
Well, both this term Balkan as a powder keg and also the term Balkans is relatively recent. The powder keg maybe last century or century and a half, and the Balkans only from the beginning or middle of 19th century, and Balkan history is much longer. Balkan was the first Europe, if you just think that the origins of European civilization lay in classical Greece, and both in ancient times. If you think about 4th century, for example, during the Roman Empire, almost all emperors were born in the Balkans. So
Constantine the Great, the most famous example.
In Niš, right? So in the 4th century, the Balkans was the core and the heart of Roman Empire, if you want. Now this has changed with the fall of Roman Empire, and that turmoil has lasted for several centuries during migrations of Slavs and Bulgars and later Hungarians and many other people who passed through or eventually settled in the Balkans. But if you think even about high Middle Ages, as we call them, there is no such a thing as Balkan, and let alone the specificities that we now associate with the Balkans.
So it's Turkish word, Balkan, right?
Yes, it's Turkish word used for every forested, wooded mountain, and most particularly the Balkan mountain in today's Bulgaria. That was wrongly associated and taught to be passing through the whole of Balkans rather than in just the mountain that we now know as Balkan in Bulgaria. So that was a geographical mistake in the early 19th century, and that name later stuck to the whole Balkans, exactly at the period where these negative stereotypes stuck to the Balkans. So it's all very recent, and it's all has to do with the Ottoman Empire, or rather with the decline of the Ottoman Empire that starts somewhere in the late 17th, early 18th century. So this is what we now consider the Balkans. It's basically the remnants or the territories that experience a decline as Ottoman Empire from 18th century onwards, and that especially in the 19th century saw the emergence of the so-called nation states, and then conflict among nations, these nation states, also many bloody, if you want, internal conflicts within these new states.
Every state had their own ideas, like Megalithian in Greece, Greater Serbia.
Yeah, so these are all features,
Yeah.
let's say, that we associate with the Balkans. But again, to reiterate, the Balkans is a 19th century invention, and also the negative stereotypes are the 19th. So Balkan is the legacy of the Ottoman Empire, and especially its decline, which means disarray, chaos, instability. And at the same time, we know the 19th century is the peak of the age of imperialism, so-called, so the emergence of European states as imperial, colonial empires. And so parallel with that decline, we have strengthening and positioning of these large European empires, who then all fight and struggle to influence the developments of what was then the last corner of Europe, which was not divided into interest spheres or between these great powers. So these two instabilities, one caused by the decline of a centuries-old empire such as the Ottoman and emergence of new, weak, fragile states, and the power games of those emerging colonial empires, at the same time contributed to instability, violence, conflict in the Balkans, which lasted all the way up to Second World War, and gave this negative image to the Balkans.
I have a very interesting question to ask, by the way. We all know that basically the Balkans is too small for the ambitions of all the Balkan countries. But in 1830, there is Greece already in the international stage. Before that, you have Serbia as an autonomous kingdom. Was those problems of borders present before the liberation of those two countries? Obviously, Bulgaria and Albania became independent later. But I just want to know, was there any type of territorial borders which were ethnically divided before the formation of the Greek state and Serbian state? And was there any people who wrote about how far is Serbia gonna go, how far is Greece gonna be, and so on?
No, absolutely not. And there was no idea of what a nation is, let alone nation states. There existed some states in the Balkan, medieval states, before the Ottoman invasion, and they were later used as blueprints, as historical precedents for the creation of new states. So the two Bulgarian empires, the Serbian Empire, the Byzantine Empire, short-lived Bosnian state, short-lived Croatian state, and so on. There were other ethnic groups who did not have their own states, and generally there were no precise ethnic borders prior to Ottoman invasion, and especially after the Ottoman invasion, when the whole territory of Balkans became one country, one empire. People moved freely about to trade, to bring their sheep to pasture, so they mixed. There were no borders or limits how they can. So there was a lot of movement and mixing of population. So there was no set borders, neither physical nor, let's say, political. So all these ideas of borders then come in the 19th century with nation-state projects, and they differ vastly and overlap vastly.
Are they authentic projects though, or they're something that comes from the West maybe, or some bigger power like Austro-Hungary, Great Britain, France, the Western powers, or they're just authentic, they're born in the country itself, like Jovan Cvic, for example? And
they are not authentic. So the socio-economic conditions in the Balkans did not produce a desire for the state or for the nationalism to rise. These ideas all came from the West, and they were first, let's say, materialized. The modern nation-state was created as a result of French and also American revolution, but obviously they couldn't jump from France into the Balkans, and they mostly came via Germany, and in Germany, or divided Germany in many states, city-states and principalities and so on. So in Germany they got this ethnic coloring that the nation, because they were as ethnic Germans divided into so many states, the ethnicity became fundamental for the creation or the unification into a single German state. So that ethnic coloring became principal in Germany, and that version of the nation or the idea of nationalism then from the north via Habsburg Empire and so on, and via trade, via schooling, lots of Balkan sons of rich Balkan merchants then went to study in Vienna, but also in many German Protestant universities, and that's where they embraced these ideas or this national, ethnically tainted nationalism, and that's how these ideas reached Balkans, and where the ground to implement them was even much more complex than in the divided Germany, because in divided Germany there were at least economic conditions, there was bourgeoisie, there was industrialization, there was power, there was money and power to create such a state, and none of these socioeconomic conditions existed in the Balkans. So we can freely say that these ideological constructs were imposed on Balkan, which until late in the 19th century was a pastoral economy or agricultural.
There was no city culture, I believe.
There were city culture in the Mediterranean. There were large cities in the Ottoman Empire, Solun, Salonika, Thessaloniki, Constantinople, Smyrna, Izmir, but in the inner Balkans there were these kasabas, small towns, so no socioeconomic conditions to grow state mentality and nationalism as envisioned first in Western Europe and as transported to the Balkans via Germany, German channels in the 19th century.
You write about the connection between nationalism and religion in the Balkans specifically. And for example, Herder, who is, I don't know if you can call it the father of nation states or nationalism, the whole idea of natio, writes that the nationalism is almost almost always is looking at the blood and the soil, while the religious fundamentalism is always with a head held high and looking at the stars, looking at the sky. So this connection is very interesting. How the religion is connected to nationalism, and especially in the Balkan states. Where does it start?
Yes, excellent question. So this is even more recent development. So I explained how Balkans is recent and how nationalism is recent. And this intertwining of religion and nationalism is even more recent. So the German or the Herder version of nationalism is, as I said, was based on ethnicity, and ethnicity was understood as language connection. So language was the key ethnic identifier. Okay? Again, important because in Germany there were confessional divisions, Protestant and Catholics and so on. So German was identified as someone who spoke German, and they thought a language was a natural feature transmitted from a mother to the child. Now we know that there could be other scenarios and that even people speaking the same language can belong to two different nations and so on. But back then this was the main feature, and this was a kind of nationalism that these Balkanites who came into contact with Herder and other German thinkers and political activists, the ethnic based or the language based. And this was all, again, in the legacy of Enlightenment. It had nothing to do with religion, nothing with church, all with nature and language being part of the nature. And this is the kind of nationalism they brought into the Balkans, and which immediately caused friction with the church, which was the confessional belonging was the main feature of the identity. So almost entire 19th century passed in the conflict between the church and these secular nationalists, those modern nation builders. They were all secular, atheists, big enemies of the church. But the socio-economic conditions in the Balkans were not conducive to their project, and the churches were constantly on the attack. So both forces, the secular, atheist, nationalists, and the confessional, religious, both forces were weakening and in this conflict, which lasted, as I said, throughout 19th century. So towards the end of the 19th century, different in different contexts, but these two forces began to approach each other and make a sort of a compromise, to describe it in a simplistic way, so that the secular nationalists realized they could not build a nation without a culture.
Is the church weaponized in a way?
Yes, absolutely.
Like
so the secular nationalists realized they have nothing to build their nation upon, so they had to embrace the religious content of the church and the confessional identity existing, and out of it they built a new nationalist come religion or confession identity. And the churches who were first such great enemies of nationalism then gave up on this fight and accepted this heresy, let's say, of organizing as an ethnic confessional nations, and now we have Bulgarian church, Serbian, Romanian, Greek, and so on. So both of them had to change and to accept part of the agenda of the other power, and along that process, the confessional and ethnic identity were merged. And only from, let's say, interwar period was this process finished. And now they present it, and most foreign observers think about it as an centuries old identification of religion and nation, but it's extremely recent. Okay, so all of this began at the late 19th century and lasted this merging between the seculars and religious, and lasted for 50 years, and in 1930s was finished. And then, strangely enough, it first occurred among the Orthodox, and thus divided what was an Orthodox ecumene or Orthodox Commonwealth throughout the Balkans in different Orthodox nations. And then the same model was copied, let's say, in Croatian nationalism, and even Albanian nationalism, or recently Bosniak nationalism, which followed the same Balkan model of this merging symbiosis between confessional and which is totally strange to Catholic Universal Global Church, let alone Islam, which does not recognize these divisions, but Muslim nationalists in the Balkans, such as Albanian nationalists or Bosniak and so on, follow the same model which was patented by Serbian, Bulgarian, Greek originally.
That's very interesting, because I don't know, I'm not sure if that happened in Western Europe in such a way that the religion merged with nationalism after the French Revolution, let's say, and it became such a big part of the local people, of the culture, such like a monument of what it means to be French. Okay, I know in Spain, Portugal, people are very religious.
Yes, but this is traditional religiosity. It's different. There are two, let's say, similar cases, the Irish and the Polish, where confessional belonging to Catholicism merged with
It's a mark of difference.
Yes, and in both cases it happened due to a feeling of being threatened due to this external threat of English in the Irish case, and Russians and Germans in Polish case. So there are similar cases, but only in the Balkans we have the whole area of the Balkans which displays this kind of nationalism, and the symbiosis of confessional and ethnic, and this happens, as I said, not only among the Orthodox, but also among the Catholic and even Muslims. So this is Balkan specificity.
Yeah. I remembered another quote from Herder, that every nationalism is born out of pain. And I don't know if you're going to agree with that, but it's just that there is a limit how much you can love your country, and if you step over that limit and go to war because of history, it's like history, especially in the Balkans, I notice, and I'm also like that. Probably I have that in me, that it's like it's a prism how we look through how we look to the present. It's kind of a very important. I know that in Serbia, obviously, you have the the Kosovo battle mid 1389, which is still living. I mean, the people they're speaking like it's been yesterday. And in Bulgaria, it's the golden age of Simeon, and Albania have Skanderbeg. And why is history so important in the Balkans?
Oh, because it was weaponized by nationalism, as nationalism usually does. It's an artificial creation, so it needs to be built and imposed on people by means of propaganda, but also by means of conscription and sending people to war. And tragically, Balkan peoples have paid extremely high price and sacrificed millions on the altar of nationalism. Maybe the worst example I can give is there were, in a space of 50 years or so, 5 wars between Serbia and Bulgaria, which were all driven by nationalism and by these artificially constructed territoriality, and they fought for an area today of Eastern Serbia or Eastern Macedonia or Eastern Vardar Macedonia and Western Bulgaria. I recently drove around these areas from Vidin down to Macedonia. Every
North Macedonia.
Yes, every neighborhood in London has more population than this vast area of 1,000 kilometers. I don't know how many more people died for this area that now live there, and they are completely abandoned by both Bulgaria, Serbia, and as you said, Northern Macedonia, Vardar Macedonia. So a total destruction and total disaster and failure of these nationalist projects. So they sent their best young men who died in various wars, Serbian, Bulgarian, 2 Balkan wars, First, Second World War. They died for these areas who are now totally abandoned and without any people.
It's really weird because it's like those wounds from the First World War, from the Second World War, from all the conflict, obviously the wars in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the wars of the 90s, they're not healed. Well, actually, I think that the West made their peace with history and continued forward, and you can't see that kind of a competition. I don't want to call it hatred because I don't think it's hatred, but there is this kind of a competition and lack of trust between the Balkan nations, and in Serbia and Bulgaria specifically. I think I can see that. You wrote a book about the Jewish diaspora in the Balkans, something that I'm interested in to hear more about is the saving of the Bulgarian Jews during the Second World War. What can you tell me about it? What do you know? I think it's like one of those things that are not many people know about it, especially in the West. I know Mikhail Barzuar, who was, I don't know if maybe I'm wrong, he was an advisor to Shimon Peres, but he was one of those kids that was saved during the Second World War.
Yes, well, it is known. There were only several, let's say, exceptional cases in the history of Holocaust. A small Jewish community of Denmark that was evacuated to neutral Sweden. Couple of thousand people, remarkable, but in terms of numbers, very small. And then Kingdom of Bulgaria, or kingdom in its old borders, which was one of the Nazi allied countries, which famously did not send troops on the Eastern Front to Stalingrad, and did not...
I think they sent one ambulance.
Okay.
This is what I know.
Yeah, Swiss sent many. This is also relatively little known, that Swiss Red Cross until 1944 only supported Nazi Germany, and all the help from Switzerland went only to one side in the war. So Bulgaria was a close ally of Nazi Germany, and as such got a reward to occupied territories it claimed, Northern Macedonia and parts of Aegean Macedonia and Thrace in today's Greece. And in 1941, as a result of Nazi German invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece, that Bulgaria participated in, it acquired these territories. Okay, it would have never got them without Nazi support or that alliance with Nazi Germany, and it is the Jews, or 11,343 precisely, of Skopje, of Bitola, Štip, and many places in Kavala, Ceres, and so on in eastern, in Thrace and eastern Macedonia, Aegean Macedonia, that were then on the 15th or 11th of March in 1943 deported by Bulgarian troops to Lom, and from there by boats to Vienna, and then by trains to Treblinka, where they were all gassed immediately upon arrival. And that is that is a very tragic taint on otherwise remarkable story of the survival of 49,000 Bulgarian Jews, the citizens of the old Bulgarian kingdom. Okay, so these 11,343 were not given Bulgarian citizenship, even though they lived in Skopje or in Ceres.
I'm going to tell you that historians in Bulgaria are still arguing whether we could have done something or whether Bulgaria couldn't do anything. And
Bulgarians have done a lot, and the Bulgarian church to
save the Jews from Macedonia.
To save the Jews from Bulgaria. They went on public protests and street protests and tried to and successfully managed to stop deportations and to persuade Tsar Boris to give up on making these concessions to Nazis. Unfortunately, they were not able to prevent these early deportations from the occupied territories, but these early deportations are still a responsibility of occupying Bulgarian state authorities, police, armed forces in these areas.
Before the start of this conversation, I actually asked you because I wanted to ask for your permission. Are you willing to talk about what's happening at the moment in Serbia? We all know about the protests. I don't think they are. The media is covering them a lot here, so much as they have to in the West. I think there is going to be a lot more coverage about this, but at the same time, these protests are going and going and going. What could be changed? What are the students fighting for? I know why they are protesting, obviously, this incident that happened on the station, if you can call it an incident. So what do you think about the whole situation?
Well, the Western media are not covering these protests for two reasons. One, more obvious than the other, namely much bigger global crisis, geopolitical crisis, two terrible wars, one in Ukraine and the other in the Middle East, in Palestine, and let's say partially and rightly overwhelmed by these two crises. On the other hand, they are also not reporting because these protests do not fit, if you want, into Western narrative of what is happening in the world and in Europe, and they don't fit into Western interests.
They're more like
both political and economic interests. So the whole turmoil, even before the incident started, with the plans for lithium excavations. So these rare materials that we see now behind conflict in Ukraine, and that Trump is making a deal about the rare materials in Ukraine, and we see all great powers, China, America, Europe, fighting around these rare materials in Africa, in Ukraine, in Asia, throughout the world, and Serbia is one of these battlegrounds because of its own dynamics and wars in the 90s. Serbia has not joined EU, thus the European environmental legislation does not exist or affect Serbia. So this excavation is possible, which wouldn't be possible in this country or in other European countries. So European Union, Germany, who has interest in these lithium batteries and so on, are not happy that people are opposing this. Okay, so that's why these protests are not positively seen. And also they are not positively seen because they are seen as creating instability. Okay, without going into details, who is right or so on, the current, and for the last 13 years, President of Serbia and so on, has been a corresponding partner of European Union, America, and so on, and has kept the area stable, which was their primary interest. So their first knee-jerk reaction is that we don't want any turmoil, any instability. We have enough instability with Middle East and Ukraine. So they were never going to get a positive coverage, which is sad, given that they were motivated by a legitimate outrage over this tragedy at the Novi Sad railway station, when a canopy of a recently renovated station, so as a result of the recent renovation, a canopy at the entrance gate fell and murdered 16 people. And people were rightly outraged, and then students of all Serbian universities walked out and declared general strike, and all universities took part throughout Serbia,
what is the solution, though?
triggered by this tragedy, but driven by enormous amount of corruption in Serbian society, which is a side effect of this special stability, if you want, or stabilitocracy, as these regimes in the Western Balkans, Albanian, Bosnian, Serbian, and so on, are titled. So they are not democracies, and European Union does not want them to become democracies or to enter European Union. They only want them stable. So we call them stabilitocracies. Okay, and Serbian president is heading one of these stabilitocracy, and that these protests threaten to undermine this stability, and unfortunately, the side effect of stabilitocracy, if European Union, your major political economic partner, tolerates you and only wants stability from you, okay, that you don't start new wars, then you have open hands for stealing European money, for corruption, for all sorts of violation of rules of law and so on. That would not be possible within European Union. But these stabilitocracies have open hands.
Is Europe afraid if Vucic is gone, what's going to happen with the country?
Absolutely.
Wow. That's a very original. I was thinking the same about Russia. That's another subject. But do we need to know what's going to happen after Putin is gone? After Behemoth comes Leviathan, or was it after Leviathan comes Behemoth?
Yes.
And that's a very serious thing.
And it's a legitimate fear.
Yeah.
But it's. We should not allow politics be driven by fear, and even the current regime is the product of EU policies in the Balkans, and this can change, and this can affect both their partners in the Balkans, if you want, and especially in the future they can change their policies and lay ground for a different Balkans. It's more than 20 years ago that in Thessaloniki there was a big meeting in 2003, I believe, which promised that the whole of Balkans would become part of EU, and now 22 years later we are nowhere closer to that aim. So it's a big failure of European integration process.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you about a lot of things, especially the Western Balkans. Instead of progressing, and when we're talking about North Macedonia, okay, Albania now it's opening clusters for the European accession talks, but the future of North Macedonia, it's a whole another issue. You know about the situation in Bulgaria there, the historical commission, the veto, and so on. I have a very strong opinion about that. I'm not gonna say it right now, but I'll probably make a special video about it, guys. Let's finish with this. How do you see the future of the Balkans, and specifically the Western Balkans? Because this is the hot area at the moment. How do you see the future of the next 5, 10, or 15 years?
Fortunately, the experience and years of experience of living in the Balkans, and years of engaging with the Balkans, especially Serbia, but also Bosnia and other countries, have rendered me quite pessimistic. Yes, and so, and knowing how complex and lengthy this process of EU integration is, and that's why I remarked that after 25 years that this process is going on with the remaining non-members. We are nowhere closer or approaching. So the end aim is not in sight, not short term, but not even mid-term. So that's a huge problem. But the biggest problem for the Balkans, as I mentioned already when describing these border areas between Serbia and Bulgaria, is depopulation. So whatever the nationalist regimes and the propaganda and so on try to, however they try to portray their countries, their successes, and so on, people vote with their feet. And in many areas, such as these border areas of Bulgaria, or the eastern Serbia, southern Serbia, eastern, rather North Macedonia, but also in Bosnia. Bosnia used to have 4.5 million 30 years ago. before the war, 35 years ago. Now it's maybe 3 million. So it's a demographic collapse, and again, it's not something that could be resolved neither short nor mid-term, and there is very limited future or economic development or any kind of development without people. So this is the greatest challenge that all Balkan countries are facing, and unfortunately not resolving, and still, as you said, obsessed with history, and which only brings cheap scoring and points, but does not change the prospects for the people and the countries that these nationalist elites tend or claim to represent.
Well, thank you very much for this nice conversation, Professor Aleksov. We didn't cover everything that I wanted to cover, but let's promise ourselves that you're going to be a guest again to the show, to the podcast, and we can talk more about Balkan history or whatever kind of history. I'm always open to that idea. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Georgi.
See you next time.